History of English Literature by O'Hida, source, Wikipedia. Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Mark Twain, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Salman Rushdie. English literature, generally seen as beginning with the epic poem Beowulf, between 8th and 11th. Geoffrey Chaucer, circa 1343 to 1400. The Canterbury Tales. Renaissance, major drama and poetry by Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, John Donne. John Milton, 1608 to 74. Paradise Lost, 1667. Satire, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, prose. Novels, Daniel Defoe, Henry Fielding. Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats. Victorian era, 1837 to 1901. Novel, leading literary genre Charles Dickens, Brontë sisters, Thomas Hardy. American poets Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Polish-born Joseph Conrad, British novelist. Irish writers, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett. Americans, poets T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound. Old English literature, 658 to 1100. Middle English literature, 1100 to 1500. English Renaissance, 1500 to 1660. Elizabethan and Jacobean period, 1558 to 1625. Late Renaissance, 1625 to 1660. Neoclassical period, 1660 to 1798. Restoration Age, 1660 to 1700. Augustan literature, 1700 to 1750. Age of Sensibility, 1750 to 1798. 19th century literature. Romanticism, 1798 to 1837. Victorian literature, 1837 to 1901. 1901 to 1939, Modernism. 1940, 99, 21st century. Old English literature, Anglo-Saxon. After the settlement of the Saxons and other Germanic tribes in England, oral tradition was very strong in early English culture, and most literary works were written to be performed. Epic poems were thus very popular, and some, including Beowulf, have survived to the present day. Old English poetry falls broadly into two styles or fields of reference: the heroic Germanic and the Christian. The Anglo-Saxons were converted to Christianity after their arrival in England. Epic poem Beowulf, 3182 alliterative lines, Scandinavia. Nearly all Anglo-Saxon authors are anonymous. The Wanderer, Old English poem, preserved only in an anthology, conveys the meditations of a solitary exile on his past glories as a warrior in his lord's band of retainers, his present hardships, and the values of forbearance and faith in the heavenly Lord. Poem. Religious theme, the seafarer, elegy mourns a loss. Middle English literature, 1100 to 1500. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the written form of the Anglo-Saxon language became less common, and under the influence of the new aristocracy law, French became the standard language of courts, parliament, and polite society. Political power was no longer in English hands. Middle English Bible translations, notably Wycliffe's Bible, helped to establish English as a literary language. Wycliffe's Bible is the name now given to a group of Bible translations into Middle English. Medieval theatre. Mystery plays and miracle plays, sometimes distinguished as two different forms, although the terms are often used interchangeably, are among the earliest formally developed plays in medieval Europe. Medieval mystery plays focused on the representation of Bible stories in churches as tableaux with accompanying antiphonal song. They developed from the 10th to the 16th century, reaching the height of their popularity in the 15th century before being rendered obsolete by the rise of professional theatre. English Renaissance, 1500 to 1660. Following the introduction of a printing press into England by William Caxton in 1476, vernacular literature flourished. Elizabethan and Jacobean period, 1558 to 1625. During the reign of Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, and then James I, 1603 to 25, in the late 16th and early 17th century, a London-centered culture, that was both courtly and popular, produced great poetry and drama. Italy was an important source for Renaissance ideas in England. Edmund Spenser, 1552–99, was one of the most important poets of this period, author of The Faerie Queene, 1590 and 1596, an epic poem and fantastical allegory celebrating the Tudor dynasty and Elizabeth I. Another major figure, Sir Philip Sidney, 1554–86, was an English poet, courtier and soldier, and is remembered as one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan age. His works include Astrophel and Stella, The Defence of Poetry, and The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. Earliest Elizabethan plays, Gorboduc, 1561, The Spanish Tragedy, 1592. Gorboduc is notable especially as the first verse drama in English to employ blank verse. The Spanish tragedy established a new genre in English literature theatre, the revenge play or revenge tragedy. Its plot contains several violent murders and includes as one of its characters a personification of revenge. The Spanish tragedy was often referred to, or parodied, in works written by other Elizabethan playwrights, including William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and Christopher Marlowe. Many elements of the Spanish tragedy, such as the play within a play used to trap a murderer and a ghost intent on vengeance, appear in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Thomas Kyard is frequently proposed as the author of the hypothetical Hamlet that may have been one of Shakespeare's primary sources for Hamlet. William Shakespeare, 1564–1616, stands out in this period as a poet and playwright as yet unsurpassed. Shakespeare was not a man of letters by profession, and probably had only some grammar school education. He was neither a lawyer, nor an aristocrat, like the university wits who monopolized the English stage when he started writing. But he was very gifted and versatile, and he surpassed the professionals, like Robert Greene, who mocked this Shake scene of low origins. Shakespeare wrote plays, 37, in a variety of genres, including histories, tragedies, comedies and the late romances, or tragicomedies. His early classical and Italianate comedies, like A Comedy of Errors, containing tight double plots and precise comic sequences, give way in the mid-1590s to the romantic atmosphere of his greatest comedies. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a witty mixture of romance, fairy magic, and rustic comic scenes. The wit and wordplay of Much Ado About Nothing, the charming rural setting of As You Like It, and the lively merrymaking of Twelfth Night complete Shakespeare's sequence of great comedies. After the lyrical Richard II, written almost entirely in verse, Shakespeare introduced prose comedy into the histories of the late 1590s. Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2. And Henry V. His characters become more complex and tender as he switches deftly between comic and serious scenes, prose and poetry, and achieves the narrative variety of his mature work. This period begins and ends with two tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, the famous romantic tragedy of sexually charged adolescence, love, and death, and Julius Caesar, based on Sir Thomas North's 1579 translation of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which introduced a new kind of drama. In the early 17th century, Shakespeare wrote the so-called problem plays, Measure for Measure, Troilus, and Cressida, and All's Well That Ends Well as a number of his best-known tragedies, including Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear and Antony and Cleopatra. The plots of Shakespeare's tragedies often hinge on such fatal errors or flaws, which overturn order and destroy the hero and those he loves. In his final period, Shakespeare turned to romance or tragicomedy and completed 3 more major plays, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, as well as the collaboration, Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Less bleak than the tragedies, these 4 plays are graver in tone than the comedies of the 1590s, but they end with reconciliation and the forgiveness of potentially tragic errors. Some commentators have seen this change in mood as evidence of a more serene view of life on Shakespeare's part, but it may merely reflect the theatrical fashion of the day. Shakespeare collaborated on 2 further surviving plays, Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen, probably with John Fletcher. Shakespeare also popularized the English sonnet, which made significant changes to Petrarch's model. A collection of 154 sonnets, dealing with themes such as the passage of time, love, beauty and mortality, were first published in a 1609 quarto entitled Shakespeare's Sonnets, never before imprinted. Although sonnets 138 and 144 had previously been published in the 1599 miscellany The Passionate Pilgrim. The first 17 poems, traditionally called the Procreation Sonnets, are addressed to a young man urging him to marry and have children in order to immortalize his beauty by passing it to the next generation. Other sonnets express the speaker's love for a young man, brood upon loneliness, death, and the transience of life, seem to criticize the young man for preferring a rival poet, express ambiguous feelings for the speaker's mistress, and pun on the poet's name. The final 2 sonnets are allegorical treatments of Greek epigrams referring to the little love god Cupid. Other important figures in Elizabethan theatre include Christopher Marlowe, and Ben Jonson, Thomas Dekker, John Fletcher, and Francis Beaumont. Marlowe's, 1564–1593, subject matter is different from Shakespeare's as it focuses more on the moral drama of the Renaissance man than any other thing. Drawing on German law, Marlowe introduced the story of Faust to England in his play Dr. Faustus, 1592, about a scientist and magician who, obsessed by the thirst of knowledge and the desire to push man's technological power to its limits, sells his soul to the devil. Faustus makes use of the dramatic framework of the morality plays in its presentation of a story of temptation, fall, and damnation, and its free use of morality figures such as the good angel and the bad angel and the 7 deadly sins, along with the devils Lucifer and Mephistopheles. After Shakespeare's death, the poet and dramatist Ben Jonson, 1572–1637, was the leading literary figure of the Jacobean era. Jonson's aesthetics hark back to the Middle Ages and his characters embody the theory of humours. According to this contemporary medical theory, behavioral differences result from a prevalence of one of the body's 4 humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, over the other 3. These humours correspond with the 4 elements of the universe: air, water, fire, and earth. However, the stock types of Latin literature were an equal influence. Jonson therefore tends to create types or caricatures. However, in his best work, characters are so vitally rendered as to take on a being that transcends the type. Jonson's famous comedy Volpone, 1605 or 1606, shows how a group of scammers are fooled by a top con artist, vice being punished by vice. Other major play by Jonson, The Alchemist, 1610. Another popular style of theatre during Jacobean times was the revenge play, which was popularized in the Elizabethan era by Thomas Kyde, 1558–94, John Webster. Webster's most famous play, The Duchess of Malfi, 1613. Late Renaissance, 1625–1660. The metaphysical poets John Donne, 1572 to 1631, George Herbert, 1593 to 1633. Neoclassical period, 1660 to 1798. Restoration Age, 1660 to 1700. Paradise Lost, 1667, and the Earl of Rochester's Sodom, the high-spirited sexual comedy of the country wife and the moral wisdom of Pilgrims Progress. John Milton, Time of Religious Flux and Political Upheaval. Samson Agonists, 1671. Milton's poetry and prose reflect deep personal convictions, a passion for freedom and self-determination, and the urgent issues and political turbulence of his day. Writing in English, Latin, and Italian, he achieved international renown within his lifetime, and his celebrated Areopagitica, written in condemnation of pre-publication censorship, is among history's most influential and impassioned defenses of free speech and freedom of the press. The largest and most important poetic form of the era was satire. In general, publication of satire was done anonymously. There were great dangers in being associated with a satire. On the one hand, defamation law was a wide net, and it was difficult for a satirist to avoid prosecution if he were proven to have written a piece that seemed to criticize a noble. On the other hand, wealthy individuals would respond to satire as often as not by having the suspected poet physically attacked by ruffians. John Dryden was set upon for being merely suspected of having written the satire on mankind. A consequence of this anonymity is that a great many poems, some of them of merit, are unpublished and largely unknown. John Dryden, 1631 to 1700, was an influential English poet, literary critic, translator, and playwright who dominated the literary life of Restoration England to such a point that the period came to be known in literary circles as the Age of Dryden. He established the heroic couplet as a standard form of English poetry by writing successful satires, religious pieces, fables, epigrams, compliments, prologues, and plays with it. He also introduced the Alexandrine and triplet into the form. In his poems, translations, and criticism, he established a poetic diction appropriate to the heroic couplet. Dryden's greatest achievements were in satiric verse in works like the mock-heroic Macflecknoe, 1682. W. H. Auden referred to him as the master of the middle style that was a model for his contemporaries and for much of the 18th century. The considerable loss felt by the English literary community at his death was evident from the elegies that it inspired. Alexander Pope, 1688 to 1744, was heavily influenced by Dryden, and often borrowed from him. Other writers in the 18th century were equally influenced by both Dryden and Pope. Though Ben Jonson had been poet laureate to James I, this was not then a formal position, and the formal title of poet laureate, as a royal office, was first conferred by letters patent on John Dryden in 1670. The post then became a regular British institution. Prose in the Restoration period is dominated by Christian religious writing, but the Restoration also saw the beginnings of two genres that would dominate later periods, fiction and journalism. Religious writing often strayed into political and economic writing, just as political and economic writing implied or directly addressed religion. John Bunyan stands out beyond other religious authors of the period. Bunyan's The Pilgrims Progress is an allegory of personal salvation and a guide to the Christian life. Instead of any focus on eschatology or divine retribution, Bunyan instead writes about how the individual sent can prevail against the temptations of mind and body that threaten damnation. The book is written in a straightforward narrative and shows influence from both drama and biography, and yet it also shows an awareness of the grand allegorical tradition found in Edmund Spenser. During the Restoration period, the most common manner of getting news would have been a broadsheet publication. A single, large sheet of paper might have a written, usually partisan, account of an event. Augustan literature, 1700 to 1750. During the 18th century, literature reflected the worldview of the Age of Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, a rational and scientific approach to religious, social, political, and economic issues that promoted a secular view of the world and a general sense of progress and perfectibility. Led by the philosophers who were inspired by the discoveries of the previous century by people like Isaac Newton and the writings of Descartes, John Locke, and Francis Bacon, they sought to discover and to act upon universally valid principles governing humanity, nature, and society. They variously attacked spiritual and scientific authority, dogmatism, intolerance, censorship, and economic and social restraints. They considered the state the proper and rational instrument of progress. The extreme rationalism and skepticism of the age led naturally to deism. The same qualities played a part in bringing the later reaction of Romanticism. The Encyclopedia of Denis Diderot epitomized the spirit of the age. The literature of the period is overtly political and thoroughly aware of critical dictates for literature. It is an age of exuberance and scandal, of enormous energy and inventiveness and outrage, that reflected an era when English, Scottish, and Irish people found themselves in the midst of an expanding economy, lowering barriers to education, and the stirrings of the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, the mock heroic was at its zenith. Pope's Rape of the Lock, 1712-17, and the Dungsad, 1728-43, are still the greatest mock heroic poems ever written. Pope also translated the Iliad, 1715-20, and the Odyssey, 1725-26. Since his death, Pope has been in a constant state of re-evaluation. His high artifice, strict prosody, and, at times, the sheer cruelty of his satire were an object of derision for the Romantic poets, and it was not until the 1930s that his reputation was revived. Pope is now considered the dominant poetic voice of his century, a model of prosodic elegance, biting wit, and an enduring, demanding moral force. In prose, the earlier part of the period was overshadowed by the development of the English essay. Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's The Spectator established the form of the British periodical essay, inventing the pose of the detached observer of human life who can meditate upon the world without advocating any specific changes in it. Periodical essays bloomed into journalistic writings, such as Samuel Johnson's Reports of the Debates of the Senate of Lilliput, titled To Disguise the Actual Proceeding of Parliament, as it was illegal for any parliamentary reports to be reproduced in print. However, this was also the time when the English novel, first emerging in the Restoration, developed into a major art form. Daniel Defoe turned from journalism and writing criminal lives for the press to writing fictional criminal lives with Roxana and Moll Flanders. He also wrote a fictional treatment of the travels of Alexander Selkirk called Robinson Crusoe, 1719. The novel would benefit indirectly from a tragedy of the stage, and in mid-century many more authors would begin to write novels. Jonathan Swift. If Addison and Steele were dominant in one type of prose, then Jonathan Swift was in another. Swift's prose style is unmannered and direct, with a clarity that few contemporaries matched. He was a profound skeptic about the modern world, but he was similarly profoundly distrustful of nostalgia. He saw in history a record of lies and vanity, and he saw in the present a madness of vanity and lies. He believed that Christian values were essential, but these values had to be muscular and assertive and developed by constant rejection of the games of confidence men and their gulls. Swift's A Tale of a Tub announced his skeptical analysis of the claims of the modern world, and his later prose works, such as his war with Partridge the astrologer, and most of all his attacks on pride in Gulliver's Travels, only left safe the individual who was in constant fear and humility. After his exile to Ireland, Swift reluctantly began defending the Irish people from the predations of colonialism. His A Modest Proposal and the Drapier Letters provoked riots and arrests, but Swift, who had no love of Irish Roman Catholics, was outraged by the abuses and barbarity he saw around him. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel.